Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. We may be muting people other than the speakers anyway. I really want to thank both Cole Harrison and Brian Garvey and other folks from Massachusetts Peace Action for their initiative and also behind the scenes work in putting this together. Also, our affiliates from Illinois, Wisconsin, and Maryland are co-sponsoring today as well. We hope this is not just a webinar, but an actionar, because we are going to have some actions that we are suggesting that you can take, and we'll talk more about that in between the two panels and also at the conclusion. My name is Kevin Martin. I'm the Peace Action and Peace Action Education Fund president. And when Cole first asked about doing this, I said, which anniversary of the Iraq War are we talking about? Because of course, it's 30 years at this point, and it's different phases of the Iraq War. And we're going to talk about Afghanistan as well, which some people talk about as the longest US war. I actually don't think that's true. I think you could say Iraq, or you could say the almost uninterrupted war against First Nations peoples since 1492. But we won't argue about that. What we're here today is to talk about ending these endless wars. And I believe there is some cause for optimism if we are clear on our demands and our actions to make progress to ending the
Kevin, you're muted yourself. You're on mute. The Zoom icon is showing you muted. There we go.
Technology, woohoo, don't know even how I did that. I was about to say we have two panels today, and we're a little tight on time, but I think we will have time for both Q&A after each panel. So without further ado, let's get started. And I'm going to introduce all three of our first panel speakers together so that I don't need to interrupt in between. First, we're going to have Danny Sjursen, retired US Army officer, contributing editor at antiwar.com, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and director of the Eisenhower Media Network. He served combat tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and later taught history at West Point. He is the author of a memoir and critical analysis of the Iraq War, Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge, and Patriotic Descent, American Age of Endless War, and co-hosts the podcast Fortress on a Hill. Next, we're going to have one of my personal sheroes and my former homegirl when I lived in Chicago for 10 years, Kathy Kelly, a US peace activist, pacifist, and author, one of the founding members of Voices in the Wilderness. I remember that well. And until the campaign closed in 2020, a co-coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence. She has frequently visited Afghanistan, Iraq, and many other countries affected by US wars and occupations, and has often led nonviolent civil resistance actions. Third, we're going to be joined by Massachusetts State Senator Jamie Eldridge. He's a leader of progressives in the Massachusetts State House and a longtime advocate of ending the endless wars and cutting the Pentagon budget to support domestic needs. This year, he introduced a bill to divest state pension funds from companies that produce nuclear weapons. Without further ado, let's have Danny.
Well, thank you so much for having me on this panel. Every time I get invited to a lot of these things, I sort of get the email and wonder, do they really want me? You know, and that's not a false humility. For a lot of reasons, there's so many impressive speakers, and there's also a sense of, it's easy to get apathetic. It's easy to feel on 18th anniversaries of this Iraq war, on 20th impending anniversaries of this version of the Afghan war that, that'll be coming up. It's hard not to kind of get down. And then you see some of the impressive speakers on the panels and you think, well, this is important. And if we're not taking action, then wouldn't that be kind of obscene? So today I'm supposed to talk about Afghanistan, and I will go against all proclivities, and I'll be brief so that we can hopefully have some questions at the end. That being said, I think I have to say a little something about Iraq. A different anniversary, right? Today being the 18th since that great euphemism of Operation Iraqi Freedom, I was in, I think, the 4th iteration of Iraqi freedom. You know, it was supposed to be, you know, one and done: invasion, freedom, democracy on the Tigris, and then out. And it didn't really pan out that way. But that was my first war. I was a new graduate of West Point, and in a sense, I was like a 23-year-old, almost childlike voyeur to, you know, this horror of a civil war that we had caused with our illegal invasion, contributed to, catalyzed, you name it. And I mean, frankly, sort of the horror and the futility and the farce of that 2006 to just about 2008 deployment was like a profound pivot in my life. In a certain sense, there's like a macabre sense of arrested development. I sort of stopped there, at least in certain ways. And I've seen a lot of things through that light. And I went to Afghanistan later through that lens, largely, of what I had sort of experienced and learned and, you know, thought I had learned from, you know, from Iraq. Anniversaries are strange things. I think events like this can be tough. I'll admit, this year has been hard on me. You know, yesterday and today, I've been kind of down. You know, I think what happens is I let like a sliver of a bit of sort of that fatalism I was talking about, that hopelessness in. But then you see the other people on the panel, the inspiring folks that are organizing and that are speaking, and you realize it's not about me, right? It's sort of about the work. And the work's a lot older than any one of us, and it's going to have longevity past. And those small actions genuinely do matter. But I'd still like to start with Iraq, if for no other reason than to juxtapose with Afghanistan. I think that it's instructive that my first war was expected to be Iraq. I think that that's interesting. You know, my class graduated 911 young officers, right, out of the academy, which is fascinating, right? Because we're the class of 9/11, cover of Time magazine, all of this. About 800 of those, by my best estimate, went to Iraq first, right? And expected to go to Iraq first. Back then, in 2005 and 6, Afghanistan was seen as like a successful war. It was the quiet war. You were lucky, right? If you got to go to Afghanistan, you probably wouldn't get yourself killed over there. This was the idea. But of course, I leave Iraq against the Iraq war. I read and I study and I experience and I see, and there's a mismatch. And now I'm against the Iraq war. I'm almost ready to say something about it, but I do like my socialized medicine and my military identity. So there's a lot of cowardice creeping in. So I'm more kind of acting out rather than being a public dissenter. I didn't have that courage at the time, and I wish I did. But I wasn't quite over the Afghan war yet. I guess you could say that I sort of faintly bought the Obama-esque line of the good war and the bad war, right? Iraq is the bad war, but the Afghan war can be won. It has to be fought. And maybe we should have given more attention to that. Maybe we should continue to give more attention and resources to it. That is not what I found. So I entered the Afghan war in the second surge. So I was lucky to make both of those surges, or of course not so lucky at all. I'm in the Iraq surge of 2006 and 7. I'm in the Afghan surge of 2011, 12. What I actually found is that down in Kandahar province, sort of out in the rural area, which was one of the real focuses of that surge, I lived on my own little Alamo, sandbagged Alamo outpost. We controlled 0 square inches of territory we didn't stand on. Sometimes we'd have to jump into the canal on the outside of our gate, right out the gate of our little outpost, because we'd be ambushed immediately. We held nothing. There was a veneer, there was a Potemkin village sort of aspect of it. We would be able to show the general's progress if we did certain things, but it was all a fantasy. The absurdity sort of Surge 2.0 was another life-changing event. It made my critique more systemic. It made me sort of realize the limits of American power, the limits of American force, and also the counterproductivity of it. And so, you know, when I speak about these issues, in some ways, I'm invited to events partly because of the veteran status and turning against the war, but I'm really skeptical of that, of myself. I always want to be careful not to make it about, oh, we lost this many soldiers and that's the tragedy of the war. The real victims, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or anybody else, are the local people who die or killed or starved in droves by, you know, U.S. policy. So I don't want to make it about that. But when we're looking at the current moment of a president making a decision on one of the longest wars in American history, depending on how we count, right? The wars against indigenous folks, and then the Philippine War was long, and the Iraq War and the Afghan War can be expanded into a broader thing since the late 70s. But nevertheless, one of the longest wars, the president currently has to decide what he's going to do about it. So that's why I'm willing to talk a little bit about policy and the veteran experience. I was in that surge at another anniversary. I was there on September 11th, 2011. Reuters wants to do a story down in the heart of the American surge in Afghanistan for the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Now, Reuters is a slick media agency. They need a New Yorker. They need a New York City kid. And they were like, go to my brigade. And they were like, New Yorkers? No. All our officers are from Alabama and Montana. This is the American Army, right? But they found a kid from Staten Island. They were like, well, that'll do. It's technically New York City. They sent a reporter to me, nice guy, spent like 2 days with me, asked me some questions. Hey, what does this have to do with 9/11? Nothing. I was a pretty dark place, I'll be honest. They sent him to the wrong guy or the right guy, depending on your perspective. I told the truth. I said, farm boys with guns. I said, I'm not into gimmicks. I'm not writing firehouse numbers on bullets. My family are firefighters. And boy, were my bosses unhappy. Oh, the colonels were just like, you couldn't just say the right thing. You had to tell the truth. And I'd say, sir, do you disagree with what I said? Well, no, not necessarily. But why did you say it? And I thought, wow, this really is sort of a fantasy. This is a Potemkin war. And this was 10 years ago. We're coming up on number 20 for that. And we have 2,500 troops in Afghanistan right now. And the discussion in establishment circles, in media, among the generals, among the think tanks, all funded by the military industrial complex is this. Do we stay with those 2,500, or maybe we go to like 5,000? I mean, everyone essentially agrees we've got to stay, which is an interesting absurdity in and of itself, an interesting echo chamber. I was there when we had more American soldiers, more NATO soldiers, than at any point in the war, 2011, early 2012. And we didn't measurably alter anything. So my question is, are we staring in the face of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and, expecting a different result. It's really interesting reading the op-ed section of the newspapers now, because all the self-styled establishment, serious people, the realists, the self-styled realists, they're now all talking precisely like the flighty fantasists that they love to decry. I mean, Admiral Stavridis just wrote a piece. Keeping troops in Afghanistan makes America safer. And then he spends 0 words telling us how. 0 words explaining that. But I'll tell you what does happen. What does happen is it tells us in his bio, unapologetically, that's my favorite part. That's most instructive. He's an operating executive consultant at the Carlyle Group and chairs the board of counselors at McClarty Associates. Well, what we know is, of course, the Carlyle Group and McClarty Associates are deeply invested in the military industrial complex. And wouldn't you know that a lot of the people on the Afghan study group, right, the Afghan group, this study group of insiders that basically just said, we have to stay. Sorry, we're serious people. We have to keep fighting this war forever. Man, they sit on a lot of the same boards as old Stavridis, who's the establishment's favorite faux intellectual admiral. They don't sound realistic. So as I kind of wrap up here and actually do what I promised for once, I'm left back with that question of hope and optimism about the war, about activism against the war, I should say. And I can't say that I'm optimistic about ending the endless wars, about reinvesting America's defense budget in human beings and working collectively to make sure that the 2 real threats to humanity, not Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but nuclear catastrophe and climate catastrophe, which require collective non-military action, not jumping in our own nationalist foxholes, but working collectively. I'm not particularly optimistic on a lot of that happening, but I don't give up hope. And I think about Biden himself. Biden told Richard Holbrooke, who wrote it in his diary before he died, that I'm not sending my son back over there to try to change this society. It's not going to work. It won't work. This is when he was vice president, and boy, was he right. I mean, he was right. So every once in a while, Joe Biden is right, and he was. his gut kind of told him the right thing. Now, the question is, he may know better. Certainly his gut is maybe better than his staff, like Jake Sullivan and these guys who just the dead shark eyes behind some of these advisors that are just insiders, political, partisan, power brokers. Will his gut play over those partisan political point scorings? But, it doesn't even particularly just matter what Joe Biden does. That's the problem with a lot of media. So as I close, what I want to say is, make no mistake, salvation, whether it's the Afghan war, which I've happened to be talking about, or any of these other indecencies in American foreign policy and its boomerang effect back home, any real change is coming from the grassroots. It's coming from activists who motivate people who don't even think of themselves as activists. It will not come from the top. Jake Sullivan won't save us. Even Joe Biden won't save us. And that's why I'm proud to be just the tiniest part of this. And I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak about it. If we get to do questions, I'll be so happy to answer anything on this or anything else. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danny. And I encourage people to check out his writings too. He's a terrific speaker, but also a fantastic writer as well. Speaking of which, another great writer and speaker and activist who's always been one of my sheroes, Kathy Kelly, is next.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'm so grateful to Massachusetts Peace Action and Peace Action National for the extremely fine work you've done educating people about so many wars. And it's a privilege, surely, to be on this particular panel. And as I see people entering from the waiting room, to realize how many of you listening to this call have worked so hard throughout your adult lives to put an end to these forever wars. So please hear a deep gratitude from me. I'm going to start with a word that maybe sometimes we lose sight of in our modern world. Mohandas Gandhi talked about truth force, satyagraha. And I think that truth telling with regard to the forever wars is extremely important, extremely needed. And maybe one of the things that I could offer would be some memories. They're anecdotal, but it happened that I was in Iraq during the 1991 war and during the 2003 war, and 27 different times over the period of the maintenance of the economic sanctions, always traveling there on purpose to break the sanctions. So I'd like to draw from some of those remembrances, thinking about the war in Iraq and then moving to the war in Yemen, which I have never visited, and I don't think it's very likely that any of us will because of the blockade there. So in 1990, perhaps one of the greatest falsehoods that came forth was spoken by George H.W. Bush. He said that the United States would never stand by and allow a larger country to swallow up a smaller country. Now, isn't it important to remind ourselves that the United States had recently invaded Grenada and invaded Panama. But in October of 1990, when George Bush spoke those words, declaring we would never allow one country to swallow up, to devour another, at 3 separate ports in Saudi Arabia, there was a massive collection growing of hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft and millions of tons of ammunition and fuel that would enable the United States to do just that, to begin devouring, destroying Iraq. It isn't the case that there were people who were greatly fearful of Iraq or even very aware of Iraq in 1990. That war was marketed, and it was marketed to the US public consistently and adamantly. The Bush administration, Bush Sr., assured people that there was no choice, there was no alternative. But in fact, a very complicit media, almost chomping at the bit for the chance to be war correspondents, for the war coverage extravaganza that was going to come up, suppressed awareness of diplomatic alternatives that had been filed, that could have been explored, and that weren't unrealistic. So it happened that in 1991, I was part of a team. We had wanted to interpose ourselves between the warring parties. It was a very idealistic effort, I'm sure. And eventually we were taken from a desert encampment by the Iraqi authorities into Baghdad while the bombing of Baghdad was still going on. And I recall distinctly being in a basement of the place where we were living, which was a pretty secure bomb shelter, but nevertheless seeing the stark fear on the faces, particularly of women holding their children when they would hear a huge explosion, and they were so worried for their children. And at that time, with electricity cut off all across the country, we couldn't know that in fact a major war crime had been committed. And so may I remind you of the February 13th, 1991 bombing of the Amaria shelter using one of these hideous bunker buster type laser guided missiles. It sealed off the exits to that shelter where at least 400 people, most of them women and children, were sleeping, and many of them were melted to death. 400 people killed, 200 people badly maimed and wounded. I mentioned that the Iraqi authorities had more or less evacuated us out of Iraq. And it was a kindly evacuation as things go. Some of our folks didn't want to, of their own conscience, board buses because they believed in principle they should remain in this camp. And the Iraqis gently picked people up and placed them on the bus in a very tense situation where they could have been understood if they acted more gruffly. But let's talk about another evacuation. Pouring out of Kuwait in 1991, when it was very clear that the only option was to more or less surrender themselves, young conscripts, many of them teenagers, disheveled, hungry, unarmed, were boxed in by the US military. Just imagine a major traffic jam. There was nowhere they could go. Some managed to run away and get into the desert or into surrounding towns, but many were stuck. And one US pilot said of the US attack on those trapped surrendering forces, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. And another pilot said, it was like a turkey shoot. I myself had gone along a road when we were being evacuated to Baghdad, and we could see vehicles that were charred and overturned and directly hit by missiles. And this was the only humanitarian road out for refugees or people seeking to flee. And it was the only way in for any kind of humanitarian supplies, which were increasingly desperately needed. And I remember we found an old abandoned typewriter in the place where we were staying. Journalists had been there. And in fact, it didn't even have a typewriter ribbon. But one thing I learned in prison the year before was if you put a piece of carbon paper in front of regular paper and bang real hard with an old style typewriter, you could make an imprint. So we were trying to type up something like a press release. And an Iraqi cabinet level official, Mr. Adnan Dawood al-Sama, came up to me, and I'm typing by candlelight because there's no electricity, right? And he said, excuse me, madame, but could you type something for us? Now imagine I'm an expat from the country that's pounding the daylights out of Iraq. And he asks us to type something for them on this abandoned typewriter with no ribbon. Upon reading the document, our group said, yes, we'll type that. Because it was a letter begging Javier Perez de Cuellar, then the Secretary General of the United Nations, please stop bombing this road. It's the only way out for refugees. Fast forward to 2003, and another great falsehood happens when George Bush Jr., George W. Bush, said our nation reluctantly enters the conflict. Our purpose is sure. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass destruction. We will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime. This was stated after 13 years of economic sanctions, of economic warfare, had punished to death hundreds of thousands of children. I remember being at the bedside of one child who could not possibly survive. The child had oral rehydration salts, not expensive, or some way to stave off the infection, like an antibiotic that the child had contracted. The child could have survived, but none of that was allowed in to help Iraqi doctors save the hundreds and thousands of children who died as a direct result of economic sanctions that the United States insisted on. All the while, a compliant media, imagining for the US that only one person really lived in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and he must be punished, and he must be crippled, and he must be stopped. And so those sanctions lasted for 13 years until George Bush Sr. took us into the shock and awe bombing. And I was there in Baghdad during that bombing, and it was shocking and it was awful. But at this point, I want to at least just make one quick departure to mention that at the same time that the United States was insisting that Iraq was a huge danger because Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, and later George Bush laughed about that lie at a press correspondence dinner, laughed about it. At the same time, the United States never stopped bolstering the neighboring country of Israel's capacity to produce weapons and to buy our weapons, Israel with at least 45 thermonuclear weapons. And the United States has always protected Israel from any kind of investigation. And may I also say, friends, that I was in Gaza during one of Israel's very bludgeoning bombardments of Gaza. And I was living kind of close to where the tunnels were. And the idea was, well, we have to bomb Gaza, Israel said, because they might bring in weaponry. Well, can you imagine what kind of a tunnel? Well, imagine the size and the dimension of the tunnel that would accommodate the United States weaponry that has gone to Israel, the D-9 bulldozers, the F-15 aircraft, the Apache helicopters, the Harpoon weapon systems. I could go on. The weapon train going into Israel from the United States would have to go through a tunnel almost the size of the Grand Canyon, it seems to me. And so when George Bush Jr. said that we will not be at the mercy of an outlaw state, I think we need to say, look, we are now at the mercy of the military contractors. We're at the mercy of people who insist that their profits, that their ability to manufacture and sell and use weapons is far more important than human life. I'm talking about Raytheon and Boeing and General Dynamics and Lockheed Martin. Let us no longer be at the mercy of those groups that can hire extremely expensive public relations companies and try to continue marketing wars. A friend of mine is in prison for his action of Plowshares Action at the Kingsway Plowshares weapon site. And Carmen Trotta said, it used to be that people made weapons to fight wars, but now it seems that we make wars to sell weapons. And this is something for which we all must atone. I've been invited to also speak about Yemen. And a friend of mine, Mil Rai, once said, one of the ways to stop a next war is to tell the truth about this war. Well, of course, my friends, it's so hard to do that because there are so many wars, as Danny has mentioned. Which war are we going to focus on? And yet again, I want to recall the death by tortuous starvation of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. And now it's happening again. And this time, David Beasley of the World Food Program has very bluntly said, this is hell. He had just gone through tours of various hospitals and clinics in Yemen and saw the children who are too hungry even to cry. All of their energy has to be focused on trying to stay alive. 400,000 children close to death by starvation. Bernie Sanders was very blunt. He said, with 400,000 children near death, lift the blockade. The United States has the leverage and has the capacity to pressure Saudi Arabia to lift this horrible blockade, which in combination with the bombing has led to the deaths of so many people all across Iraq. All across Yemen. Let's keep in mind that Yemen is not necessarily a poor country. It's in fact a resource-rich country. And I believe that that's the reason why Saudi Arabia has been waging this war, now moving into its 7th year. Saudi Arabia, I believe, prolongs this war because it wants to have control and to bludgeon Yemeni people into submission. And then Saudis could have control over fisheries, over oil-rich reserves that are in the eastern part of the country and the western part of the country, and that very strategic port, the Bab al-Mandab. The reports that have come about the Houthi war show that, in fact, blockade or no blockade, they have managed to gain control over much of the north of Yemen. And to say that we want to stop US support for the Saudi-led coalition does not mean that we therefore want to support the Houthis. Certainly they have engaged in blockades themselves, blocking food and oil. They've engaged in human rights abuses and violations, but there is nothing that the Houthis possess which even begins to touch what the United States has supplied Saudi Arabia with in terms of weaponry and formerly of fuel and intelligence and cover at the United Nations. And certainly with regard to the urgency of lifting the blockade, if the blockade isn't preventing the Houthis from getting weaponry, then is the purpose of the blockade to punish innocent civilians? I think that my time has been used now, and I'm sorry if I've gone over time, but I do again want to thank everybody who has come to this panel and urge you, please, be in touch with your elected representatives, telling them that it's crucial that the blockade be lifted, that increased aid be given to people in Yemen who are now facing so much desperation, and that the United States stop all sales of weapons to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia-led coalition. Keep in mind that ships are departing from the port of Baltimore carrying different kinds of very sophisticated weaponry on a monthly basis. Keep in mind that the Marinette shipyard in northern Wisconsin is manufacturing littoral combat ships for sale to Saudi Arabia. And from Chicago, I'm sorry to report, the Boeing company is selling 650 laser-guided missiles to Saudi Arabia. This is wrongful, and we can work hard to stop it.
Thank you, Kathy. I always appreciate hearing the way you speak about such difficult topics so gently and kindly. And I can't get enough. You could talk all afternoon as far as I'm concerned. But we are moving on because we have other speakers. We are going to have a short amount of time after this panel for some questions and answers. If you can put them in the chat, we'll get to a few. There won't be a whole lot of time. We're going to have then also just a little bit of suggestions for actions you can take, and then the second panel. So the final speaker of this first panel is State Representative from Massachusetts, Jamie Eldridge.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. Hope everyone can hear me, and honored to be on this panel. I always learn so much on all of our interventions around the world. And I really just want to thank Danny and Kathy for their leadership. And I feel a little embarrassed to be on this panel with them because I have nowhere near the amount of activism on ending endless wars or their work across the world. But I just want to say, as a state senator in Massachusetts, proud to be part of Mass Peace Action. I'm actually outdoors in between rallies, both Stop Asian hate rallies and supporting the Amazon workers in Alabama that are looking to organize. So I apologize for the informal setting. but really just wanted to highlight, because the district I represent includes a military base, sort of the remnants, if you will. The former Fort Devens was a major military base, was closed in 1996, but there is still a Army training base in Devens. And I took the opportunity to take a tour of it, sort of at the height of Obama's escalating the Afghanistan war. And, you know, this was at a time when my constituents were really struggling as a result of the Great Recession. And yet taking a tour of this base, there were new facilities, there were new training grounds, both for soldiers going to Iraq and to Afghanistan. And it really highlighted to me how the military budget continues to flow endlessly without any consideration for our domestic needs. And so as a state senator, certainly raising that issue. Of course, right now at the state level, we have a major deficit in our state budget. And so as much as I appreciate the dollars coming from the American Rescue Plan, I know that it's still not going to be enough to meet the needs. And if we could just cut our military budget, imagine the improvements in combating climate change, investing in transportation, combating poverty, investing in education could happen. So I'm always trying to lift that up with my colleagues and advocate with our congressional delegation, whether our congressmen and women or our US senators. I do want to highlight that there are opportunities at the state level. I appreciate working with Mass Peace Action to support and to file a bill that would divest our state pension system from any companies that build or help create nuclear weapons. So I think sometimes in Massachusetts, we forget that there are many companies that build weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. And really, this state divestment bill is an opportunity to take a stand on that and say that we should not be involved in supporting endless wars, whether going on right now in Afghanistan or Yemen, or the bigger discussion around nuclear weapons and, you know, trying to move to a full moratorium on that. So thanks so much for having me. I'm really honored to be on this panel, and I really appreciate being invited by Cole to speak at this Mass Peace Action and Endless Wars Forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. We really appreciate and wish we could all be there with you at the 2 rallies that you're at as well today, and that you were able to make time for us is fantastic. We really appreciate that. So we do have about 10 minutes or so for Q&A from this panel, and I'm going to go ahead and take one that was in the chat. Phyllis Bennis, who's going to be on our next panel, I know addresses this. I've heard her address this before, but either Danny or Kathy could take this one. We who read The Kite Runner years ago have been under the belief that we need to be in Afghanistan to protect women and help their progress in human rights. Any truth to that?
I mean, I'll just quickly start. I think this is a really tough issue, and a question that every time I receive it, I feel like the answer is inadequate, because there are real costs, right, to women the world over, right? And whenever something goes wrong, the impoverished, minority groups within countries, and let's be clear, the other half of the sky, right? I mean, women generally are hurt. The question, I think, is one of consistency. Do the people who say that we have to stay in Afghanistan, do they really care about women's rights? Did they care about women's rights before the invasion? Was this their priority? Was this the motivation? These people who work for Raytheon and think tanks that are funded by Raytheon and Lockheed, are we really to believe that the reason they want to stay is that, or is it an after the fact justification? That's one thing that bothers me. But even if we take that aside, something else is, can US military force measurably alter, you know, Afghan society, the condition of women in that country? And, you know, I have studied and experienced this enough to come to the conclusion, one that I'm really confident in, which is that the American military and the Pentagon is a chaos machine. It is a chaos producing machine, and it is counterproductivity. That's its product. And so I just sort of reject that line of argument. And also the idea that 2,500 US troops, or even if we go up to 5,000 US troops and send a few more drones over there, are we going to, drone bomb our way to, women's rights in Afghanistan? I mean, this is not on the table. This is not in the plans. This is a canard, and it's a real hypocrisy. And that does not mean that I don't feel awful about it. And really, I don't even like answering this question, but I think it's important to answer it honestly.
It is tough. And one of the things you can look at, first of all, is that the objective? Is that why US troops are in Afghanistan? And you have to say absolutely not, but also just look at the outcomes. Afghanistan, unfortunately, remains one of the worst places in the world to be a mother and having a child in terms of, infant mortality and also the death of the mother. So if you claim that that's a justification, it's an abject failure. Kathy, did you want to weigh in on this issue as well?
I think Danny has spoken very, very well on this issue, and maybe we can see, I noticed there are quite a few other questions there.
Very good, there are, and I'm scrolling through. There are a couple questions about the clarifications about US weapons going to Saudi Arabia that are then used in Yemen. And Kathy was right in terms of the US having pulled back some of the in-air refueling and logistical sharing, supposedly, if we can trust that. But Kathy, did you want to try to clarify that? There were a few questions about that in terms of US weapon sales to Saudi Arabia.
Well, I wish that I could arrive at more clarity, honestly, because Senator Biden, I think, did send a very good message out. And to his credit, he said that the United States would stop funding and selling offensive weaponry for the Saudis to use. But of course, the devil is in the details. Which weapon contracts have been abrogated? As best I can tell, none. You can go to the Marinette, Wisconsin shipyard and see them celebrating a few days ago the beginning of construction of a second ship that is exactly the kind of ship that's being used to enforce this horrible blockade. I think that the weapon sales to Saudi Arabia have enabled the Saudis to prolong this war. And several people in the chat questions had also mentioned, well, what about the Houthi? Aren't they also diverting funds in order to maintain their governance and their strength and their war? And I want to emphasize that you will not find good guys, I don't think, amongst the warring parties in this conflict. But we in the United States are responsible for our complicity with the bludgeoning of Yemen by the Saudis, and this having been done with also with our cover for them at the Security Council and through the United Nations. I would like to encourage people to be in touch with Dr. Aisha Juman, an epidemiologist who herself is Yemeni, and particularly on Twitter every day, she gives us a very fine education, along with a Yemeni American professor, Shireen Al-Ademi, and then of course, Hassan Al-Tayyab with the Friends Commission on National Legislation.
And of course, people in Yemen know that some of the bombs that have been dropped on civilians are made by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, et cetera. So there's no question about that. Here's one on Afghanistan. Is our quest to control access to resources such as minerals like lithium, which is needed for a renewable future, fueling the occupation of Afghanistan and other sources of rare minerals? Afghanistan is supposedly one of the richest sources of these rare earth minerals in the world. I personally am always skeptical of looking for, there's the one imperialist reason that we want to be in this country, but I don't think it can be discounted. I don't know if either Danny or Kathy want to take a crack at that one.
I'm also skeptical of like straight economic determinism. I think it's a factor that may have played into US concern for the region. But I do think that once wars start, they come off the rails and we lose control of them. And so I don't think that most of the arguments now really surround that, because even the interventionist realists who are completely unrealistic, I don't think they really believe we can maintain a fixed control of Afghanistan or get it into a place where, you know, just extract all the resources. So I don't think it's that simple. I think that wars are really easy to get into, hard to get out of, and then you lose control and they end up looking like a different thing than they planned in the beginning.
Thanks, Danny. Here's a good one that is more about movement dynamics. And if I had a good answer to this one, I could speak a little bit from a peace action perspective, but I'd rather not. Why is the peace movement having a difficult time recruiting young people and veterans from the war on terror?
Would you like me to take that one?
Sure.
I didn't want to just jump on every question. Well, you know, I think that part of the reason is, so with the veteran side, I think that there's a sense of identity loss if you get into the peace movement, that you're somehow like selling out your brothers. So we know that about 73% of Afghan veterans are for a full withdrawal, but how many of them are actually public and active and, you know, taking a stand in some way? Very few. But I think in general with young people and with the movement in general, and I am not experienced enough an activist to be the perfect answer on this, and I hope maybe if we had time, Kathy could weigh in, but I think people sense that it's kitchen table issues we're worried about. If I had any sort of answer to that, an inadequate but I think useful one would be militarism is a kitchen table issue, is the message. You know, it boomerangs back home. There are trade-offs, there are opportunity costs. You know, I'm from the be all you can be Army commercials, recruiting commercials generation. So I've been saying on shows, I think the Pentagon needs a snappy slogan, and it should be, you know, the Department of Defense, this is why you can't have nice things, because the trade-offs in human investment and infrastructure investment and the boomerang effects of, say, militarized policing are palpable. So I think we have to connect those and not treat them as discrete issues, as too often I think they are, not necessarily in the peace movement, but in a general sense in the media especially.
Kathy, did you want to address that as well?
You know, I'd like to make an appeal to the
Okay.
faith-based communities, to the university communities. Help us out. Help us with this matter of educating young people who have a valid concern about climate catastrophe. I mean, the world they're inheriting is one that is terrifying, but we can't have a reasonable, a rational discussion about coping with the very real terrors that we face in terms of climate catastrophe. Let me also add in the carceral state and the prison industrial complex, the reality of so many people fleeing from wars. We can't have a rational discussion about being able to find the ingenuity, the resources, the money to deal with those problems if we don't first deal with dismantling the demonic suction cup which the Pentagon and the United States military represent. We need help from the university communities and the faith-based communities and community leaders like the very wonderful states representative you just included on today's webinar to help accomplish that educational task. Because we don't only face a military industrial complex, we face a military industrial media congressional complex. And it's kind of a vice-like grip on education. So to get the young people activated requires a kind of full frontal, full-on education effort.
Thanks, Kathy. Is Senator Eldridge still on? Because I had a quick question for him, but I'm not sure that he is still on. He may have had to go to his other rally. Okay. Ruth Strauss.
He took off, yeah.
Ruth Strauss, go ahead and ask your question, please. You'll have to unmute yourself if you're still muted.
Yes, hi, thank you. All of you have been wonderful. This is to Kathy, but anybody can answer, including Danny. How can we avoid, if we can, the usurpation of our funds by the Houthis that are supposed to go to the Yemeni people? And the same thing is happening in Iran. I have, friends in Iran, and our aid gets confiscated. So if you could address that, or anyone address that.
Thank you, Ruth. I'd like to take a beginning step at addressing that. Certainly we can't deny, we should acknowledge that the Houthi have imposed taxes on humanitarian aid coming into the country, diverted aid. However, we should also, I think, look to the humanitarian groups on the ground who are saying that they have made progress of late in being able to negotiate with the Houthi. And that comes from David Beasley of the World Food Program. And also Oxfam worked very hard to reverse the foreign terrorist organization designation that the Trump administration had placed on the Houthi. And had that designation gone through, it would have created all manner of complications and great delays in bringing urgently needed supplies and food and fuel into the country. And in their effort to resist former Secretary of State Pompeo's designation, hundreds of NGOs signed letters saying, look, we can deal with the Houthi better than we can deal with this kind of terrorist designation. I hope that makes sense. Again,
Thank you.
But people put in the chat the spellings of the names for the people I recommended before. So I hope everybody can save the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you very much. Danny, did you have anything you wanted to add on that last question?
Just very quick, I think that, without taking the onus or the agency off of the Houthis, I do think that we have to understand the view from North Yemen, right? The view from the Houthis, which is one of profound mistrust. They've been demonized to such an extent that I can see why there would be concern with anything the United States is trying to do, even the humanitarian side, and that's not correct. But I'll say this: the connection between the Houthis and Iran has always been exaggerated as a way to justify support for the Saudis and the UAE. But I will say sometimes I like to think about cutting the Gordian knot, going big. And one of the ways to pull the rug out from a lot of this mistrust and the war itself would be to take what shouldn't be, but would be considered a radical act, which is normalization of relations with Iran. Just take the rug right out from under this regional Cold War that fuels so much of this. I hate to say it, but go to Tehran to solve so many of the regional issues, or at least mitigate them. And of course, that's not really being considered, but that's the step. I think it really is.
Thank you. I wasn't linking the two, although, Iran may be backing the Houthis, but I wasn't linking the two. Thank you so much for your clarity.
Well, and I do think for people that want to know more about the Yemen conflict, and this is not to say that I or Peace Action is taking a position in favor of the Houthis. I do totally agree with Danny, though, about the need for a broader détente between the US and Iran. Iranians are the most pro-Western people around, and we should be friends. The Houthis have been in that part of Yemen for like 1,300 years and have been disenfranchised and haven't had their own self-governance for almost all of that time. So they do have a legitimacy in that part of the world that I encourage you to learn more about if you can. I want to thank so much Danny and Kathy and Jamie for that first panel. Before we get to our second panel, which we're going to very soon, I did just post in the chat a link to a Google Doc, which is an action page that Peace Action came up with. And I believe Cole or Brian will also have an action page from Massachusetts Peace Action. Without going into it in great detail, and you should look at it later, don't look at it instead of listening to our speakers. There are actions that you can take in terms of letters to the editor, in terms of public education, in terms of contacting Congress. There's a QR code that if you have a safe, hopefully public event, in-person event, you can print it out and post it on the wall. People can use their phone, so it's safe and socially distanced, to sign on to a letter asking for an end to the wars and to cut Pentagon spending. The issues around the AUMFs, the authorizations for the use of military force, which we didn't really get into, both the 2001 first one for Afghanistan, or really the global war on terror, and the 2002 are very much under scrutiny, and even Biden has said some good things about this. We think we have a chance to win this year on getting rid of the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. The 2002 might be a little more difficult, but even the Obama administration, when they were in office, agreed that those were no longer legitimate legal justifications for the United States to be in Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen or anywhere else. So there's a lot that we can do on these issues. And of course, one of the best things we can do is to get our friends and families and colleagues more involved with the organizations that are here today, with other local peace and justice organizations as well. So when you have a chance, please check out that link that I posted for the action toolkit, and we'll post that again later, and certainly before we end. And I don't know if we're going to be able to do email follow-up with that. I'm not sure. I didn't look into that, but we want to encourage people as much as possible to use the tools that we put together, including some sample hashtags for tweeting on these issues as well. Okay, so as I am an ardent proponent of trying to stay on time, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to keep us on time, and we're going to move into our second panel right now. 3 more fantastic speakers. Again, one of my sheroes, and she is my homegirl now in Washington, D.C., Phyllis Bennis. She directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on Middle East, U.S. wars, and UN issues. She co-founded the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, which I'm on the advisory board of, actually, and now serves on the National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace. She has written and edited 11 books, including the just published 7th updated edition of her popular Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, Before and After U.S. Foreign Policy and the War on Terror, and Challenging Empire, How People, Governments, and the UN Defy U.S. Power. Our second speaker will be Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, retired from the United States Army, Distinguished Professor of Government and Public Policy at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. He was the Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell from 2002 to 2005 during the start of the Iraq War. And then our third panelist, Vijay Prashad, is an Indian historian and journalist, author of 30 books, including Washington Bullets, Red Star Over the Third World, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, and The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. He serves as a chief correspondent for Globetrotter and a columnist for Frontline in India, and chief editor of Leftward Books, New Delhi. So let's get started with the incomparable Phyllis Bennis.
And Kevin, we don't seem to have Larry yet, so I'm still looking to get him on.
Ah, okay. We may have to juggle the order then. Go ahead, Phyllis.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all. Thank you to Peace Action. Thank you to all of you for spending what, at least here in DC, is an incredibly gorgeous sunny Saturday, talking about these crucial issues and what we as movements can do. I'm supposed to talk about, among other things, an evaluation of Biden's foreign policy. I think it actually is still a bit too early for a real evaluation, but there are some new realities that we should be recognizing. And we do know, of course, that the Biden foreign policy, however it plays out, is not going to be our foreign policy. That's a given. The question will be, and I will end with this as well as start with it, is what our movements can do to make it better, to make it closer to ours. What I think we're looking at is that there's a foreign policy process underway that is shaped by real crises, real global crises that are very different from the created, claimed military and strategic crises that the US claims to be focused on. The US goals of projecting military power, expanding military bases, the question of control of oil and other resources, as we were hearing about earlier in Afghanistan and elsewhere, maintaining global alliances that are designed to prevent the rise of regional challengers, such as the case in Iran. All of these are the military and strategic crises that we are told are the basis for US foreign policy. The reality is this is a moment where certainly the pandemic, certainly global warming, but also issues of global authoritarianism, global inequality, the global refugee crisis, which doesn't exist here, but does exist in many parts of the world. The rise of new wars that are spreading around the world. All of those are separate from these US military and strategic goals, but they are framing a new world that takes into account all of these other questions. So we know that foreign policy is not going to be the first priority for the Biden administration for the first 3 months, the first 6 months, maybe even the first year. I had thought a long time ago, like a month, I had thought that what we were going to be looking at was more likely a scenario where the main priorities, the first priorities would be the domestic crises around the pandemic and the economic crisis that grew from the pandemic. And we're seeing a great deal of attention appropriately being focused on that. The racial reckoning that emerged over the summer's protests around the murder of George Floyd and all that has come from that is clearly very strong on the agenda because we're dealing with a new political moment. And the political moment is one that is shaped by a rising progressive wing within the Democratic Party, not yet a dominant wing, but with far more influence and agency within the party and within Congress as a result that we've seen probably since the 1930s. People of color have been elected, progressives are being elected, and the recognition is in the Biden administration that it's not only about who's being elected to Congress, but the very stark reality that it was people of color, particularly Black women, who voted in the Biden administration. And they are having to deal with the consequences of that and know who, to some degree, they're going to have to be accountable. We also have seen that as these two wings of the party emerge, the centrist right wing and the progressive and left wing, we know that on some of our issues, the movements in those issues have far more influence and power than others. So I would say that the two wings are closer to each other on issues around climate, immigration, the economy and healthcare linked, and maybe in a slightly lesser way, racial justice and labor issues. They're not together, but they're closer on those issues than on some others. Where the biggest gap exists between the two wings of the party is, frankly, on foreign policy, policies around war and peace, all of that. And that's an enormous challenge to us because part of that, not only, but part of that reflects the reality that our movement, the anti-war movement, the self-defined anti-militarism movement, is simply not as powerful and not as influential right now as it has been in other periods. And it's not as powerful as some of these other movements. So we are dealing with that very stark reality. The key is going to be the role of the issues around war, the issues around military spending that we've just been hearing about, the $740 billion a year that we're spending this year that goes directly to the Pentagon. That's 53 cents out of every discretionary federal dollar goes directly to the Pentagon. So it answers the question of, well, Medicare for all is a great idea, but how are you going to pay for it? Well, that's a start of how you're going to pay for it. How you're going to pay for it involves cutting the military budget. So that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of this political moment. We do see very important, powerful movements. The Movement for Black Lives, the Poor People's Campaign, and others are creating positions that include the question of cutting the military budget, ending militarism both at home and militarization of domestic as well as foreign policy. And we need to maintain and build on those relationships with those other movements to make this happen in a stronger way. I would say that some of the early executive actions that the Biden administration took were actually very positive, more so than I anticipated, mainly about reversing some of Trump's appalling decisions, but some also making things better, ending the Muslim ban, some of the immigration moves, canceling the XL pipeline, rejoining the WHO, starting an investigation of white supremacy within the US military, ending the 1033 program where the Pentagon gives military equipment and weapons to local law enforcement. All of these things, although the 1033 one hasn't happened yet, it's probably going to be in the next week or two. All of these things reflect an early commitment to some of what our movements have been demanding for a long time. That was quite positive. Then we get to the broader questions of policy, particularly war policy, particularly in the Middle East region, the greater Middle East, and things don't look so positive. In the Middle East, more broadly, of course, we saw coming out of the Trump years that the framework was all about Iran. It was about building up an anti-Iran coalition. It was the way the US was looking at the war in Yemen, had everything to do with the anti-Iran coalition. It had to do with why Israel was moved in the Pentagon's mind out of the European theater and into CENTCOM, Central Command, which is the military command that includes all of North Africa, the Middle East. Israel was always excluded because it didn't have decent relations with any of its neighbors. Now, because of the so-called Abraham Accords, the normalization of Israel in the region is well underway, supported by the Trump administration, and that has moved Israel into CENTCOM. The Palestinians are being abandoned and ignored. The question of the US support for Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the context of Yemen is on pause at the moment, but it's not over. The military sales are paused, but they're not canceled. So we're looking at a very difficult challenge. So let me just mention quickly a couple of specific ones around Iran, around Palestine, and then come back to our movements a little bit. So on Iran, I think there's no question that Biden really wants to return to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, partly because that was Obama's, arguably his most important foreign policy accomplishment. And Biden, if nothing else, wants to continue claiming credit for everything that that Obama did that is popular. And the Iran nuclear deal is still pretty popular at the public level. So I think there's no question he wants to return to the deal. He has spent some political capital in making that happen. The appointment of Wendy Sherman as the Undersecretary of State, she was the one who was the head of the team that negotiated the deal originally. So that took a little bit of pressure. And then particularly the appointment of Rob Malley from the International Crisis Group to be the Iran envoy, to lead the negotiations. That took a fair amount of political capital because Rob, for a whole host of reasons, which we could talk about later, was very much in the crosshairs of both Republican and Democratic warmongers who saw him as too soft on Israel, too soft on the Palestinians and not strong enough supporting Israel, too soft on Iran, all of which meant he's a diplomat's diplomat. And that was sort of not acceptable for a lot of people. Biden's willingness to spend some political capital to get him in there was an optimistic moment. But so far, what we're seeing is that the anti-Iran momentum that Trump had kept in motion, most particularly the crippling, horrific economic sanctions imposed on Iran, not only the original sanctions from before the deal that went back into effect when Trump pulled out of the deal, but a whole bunch of new sanctions. All of that still exists. The Biden administration has not ended those sanctions, and keeping the sanctions is by far the most important danger in making the possibility of going back to the nuclear deal much more difficult. The most important component right now has to do with timing. You know, the Iranians, after a certain point with the US abandoning the deal and walking away from it, said to the Europeans, if you can't make good on your commitment to compensating us for what these US sanctions have done to our economy, which has led, among other things, to the death of children for the first time in modern Iranian history. Children have died of malnutrition, and a lot of people have died from the inability to get medications and equipment in hospitals. Not because they're not explicitly excluded from the sanctions officially, but in the real world, those exclusions don't matter. Banks and companies that produce crucial medicines are just not willing to take the risk that the US is not going to hold them accountable for sanctions violations and try to arrest their CEOs or impose multi-million-dollar fines or God knows what. So the US is directly responsible for the impact of sanctions on people in Iran. And it's for that reason that the politics inside Iran, with elections coming up in June, are going to be so tricky, so tricky. So the whole question of how that's going to play out in this very short window remains a very, very crucial question. And it's one that's not looking very good right now. We don't seem to see any evidence that there are backdoor talks underway. On the question of the so-called forever wars, there was an executive order that called for reviewing the counterterrorism operations. You know, one of the problems that we face, there's a lot of talk, and has been for a while, about withdrawing troops, particularly from Afghanistan, which is good. There's 2,500 troops, US troops left in Afghanistan that are not keeping Afghans safe. They're certainly not keeping people in this country safe, but they're not, in a certain way, the real problem. The death of civilians that are accountable to the United States is not being carried out by those 2,500 ground troops who are basically backing up local forces and training them. It's coming from air wars and drone wars. And there's no talk about ending that. When we hear talk about pulling out the troops, we have to keep saying over and over again, and end the drone war and end the air war that is in fact killing civilians every day inside Afghanistan. So that's going to be a major challenge. Right now, the US is saying, the Biden administration is saying they're likely not to pull out all the troops as they had agreed, as the Trump administration had agreed to in the deal with the Taliban, that they want an extension, and if the Taliban refuses, they may refuse it anyway. And it's the same in a sense as what the Iranians are facing with, where Biden says, look, those were Trump sanctions. We're different. We're not Trump anymore. And the Iranians are saying, those are US sanctions. The Taliban is saying the same thing. You may not like the agreement that your former president signed, but he was the president and he signed that agreement. And therefore you're bound by it. And the US is saying, actually, maybe not so much. So we have a serious problem with that with the Biden administration. There's some potential around Yemen because there's a lot of popular support for ending all US support for the Saudi war in Yemen, but we don't know how that's going to play out. Congress voted in both houses to end that support. Again, not including ending the air war, the separate air war that the US says is the counterterrorism part. So we have to continue that as if there was, in fact, a military solution to terrorism, what we all know is not true. But there's a potential there because Congress is supporting it. It's going to take a lot of work to make good on any of those promises, even around Yemen, which might be the lowest hanging fruit of all of them. On Palestine, we know that there has been an enormous discourse shift. There's new members of Congress who have been elected, not only the squad, but new members in this last election, who are much more clear that whether it was ever true or not, it is certainly no longer true that criticizing Israel is an act of political suicide. And there is now talk in Congress about moving towards a series of acts that would lead to conditioning US military aid to Israel on human rights terms. So making sure that we don't treat Israel differently than every other country. What many of us are accused of sometimes. You treat Israel in ways that you never treat any other country. In fact, it's the people who want to maintain the $3.8 billion a year in military aid to Israel that are treating Israel differently than every other country. Our position is, my position is, we shouldn't be sending arms to any country, and particularly countries that violate human rights. We shouldn't be sending military aid or selling arms to Saudi Arabia, to any of these countries. So we are just saying, treat Israel like every other country. And now there are people in Congress who are making that real as a possibility. The discourse has shifted in a very partisan direction, so that we know that in recent polls, 61% of Republicans had a favorable view of the Israeli government, while only 26% of Democrats said the same thing. That's a huge shift from the bipartisan position that we've seen for so long. And we know that we are now seeing people being elected with that as a component of their campaign position, younger people, Black members of Congress, other members of color. And that's a real shift that we have to take advantage of, because at the same time that we're seeing these victories in the public discourse, the political discourse and political action has not yet changed. And that's the enormous point of challenge for all of us, is to make that political shift real out of the public and media discourse shift that is underway. So that means a lot of work for our movements at a moment when our movements are being attacked quite viciously by supporters of US aid to Israel, et cetera, the pro-Israel lobbies in the Christian Zionist movement, in the evangelical community, in the Jewish community. But even there, particularly in the Jewish community, there's a massive shift underway where young Jews are no longer assuming that their identity as Jews has to be bound up with support for Israel. You have organizations like the organization I work with, Jewish Voice for Peace, staking out a position that is grounded in Palestinian rights. And as long as we keep our focus on the question of rights, on the question of equality, not getting caught up in all this debate about one state or two states, red state, blue state, but keeping it on equality for all and the rights of Palestinians, we will be able to build an ever stronger movement. So let me end with just a bit on this question of the challenges and the dangers we're facing. On the question of the military budget, which, as Kathy and others were saying earlier, is so crucial in building the work of all of our related movements, whether it's Medicare for all, whether it's the Green New Deal. Paying for all those things has to start with cutting the military budget. There was a move last year to cut it by only 10%, and it reached 93 votes in the House, which was quite extraordinary, given that there's never been that kind of a vote on cutting the military budget at all. But of course, 93 votes isn't close to what you need to pass it, and 10% is really not very much, except when you're talking about 10% of $740 billion. You're talking about a lot of money. That is not chump change. So 10% is not a bad start. The Poor People's Campaign, the Institute for Policy Studies, and many other organizations are calling for 50% cuts, that we should be cutting 350 billion out of that 740, and we'd still be a lot safer. So that's one of the things that we have to keep central, I think, in all of our work. And then finally, it comes back to this question of our movements. What our movements are going to be able to do to make good on the political moment that we find ourselves in. First, we have to force this administration to make good on the promises they made about Yemen, about Saudi arms, about the Paris climate deal, about Cuba, about withdrawing troops, about Iran and the nuclear deal that was supposed to be on day one. All of that depends on our movements. We're going to have to fight just for the things that Biden already said he would do, but hasn't done yet. And he's not going to do it unless we fight for it. They're going to have to make concessions. They're going to have to know that people in this country will support those concessions. We have to work with our movements in a global way. We have to make sure that the movement for Black Lives, that 350.org and Sunrise and all of the movements in the climate justice movement and others are getting everything they need to show what we've known for a long time about the links between climate and militarism. That's on us. That's our job, to work with all of these other movements and to support the new, younger anti-war movements that are rising, dissenters, Justice is Global, that are made up of young people, people of color primarily, in all the ways that our legacy anti-war movements have talked about needing to bring in younger people and more people of color. They're creating their own organizations. And we have the opportunity now to help them build and to be part of this broader movement moment that we're seeing. And at the same time, build internationalism into all of our movements. We have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. And I already see some great fodder in the chat for Q&A that I will get to, and I'm trying to keep an eye on. Next, we have one of the absolute best voices in terms of anti-militarism and anti-imperialism, Vijay Prashad.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be with you. Today is the day after the United States in 2003 conducted its illegal war against Iraq. I just want to say something about our language. We talk about the Iraq war. There is no such thing as the Iraq war. There is the United States war that was imposed on the people of Iraq. There's no such thing as a Vietnam War. You know, there's no Vietnam War. There's the United States imposed war on Vietnam. There's no Afghan war. I mean, look at the way the language distances conflict. It's not a US war that was imposed on the Afghan people. It becomes the Afghanistan war, the war in Afghanistan, the Afghan war. It's not an Afghan war. It's the US war imposed on Afghanistan. There is no Iraq war, okay? In 2003, March 19th, the United States used devastating force illegally against the United Nations Charter to attack the country of Iraq. It's not an Iraq war. It's an American war. It's a US war. The United States prosecuted that war. The United States is responsible for that war. Its allies, United Kingdom, responsible for that war. If we had a just world order, George W. Bush and Tony Blair would appear before the International Criminal Court for having prosecuted an illegal war. Now, I use the word illegal. I'm not using the word illegal morally or out of being personally outraged or anything. This is not a matter of personal taste. It's an illegal war because a year after that war began, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who's, basically not a person with any great anti-American sensibility. Kofi Annan went on BBC. It took him a full year after that war began. On BBC, Kofi Annan said it's an illegal war. It goes against the UN Charter. It's a war of aggression for which there should have been some accountability, but there's never accountability. Well, look, that war starts, and as a consequence of the two wars that the United States government prosecuted, the war against the Afghan people in 2001, the war against the Iraqi people in 2003, as a consequence of these two wars, both on the flanks of Iran, the United States delivers the Iranian people, the Iranian government, a strategic victory. Because in a flash, the United States government took out two of Iran's great adversaries, the Taliban on this side, on the eastern side, and Saddam Hussein on the western side. You'll remember that it was the United States government and the Gulf Arabs, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and others, that paid Saddam Hussein in 1980. They paid Saddam Hussein to prosecute a murderous 8-year war against Iran. Was that an Iran-Iraq war? That was not an Iran-Iraq war. That was a war that the West and the Saudis and the other Gulf Arabs paid the Iraqis to prosecute against the Iranian people. That was not an Iran-Iraq war. That was also a war imposed on Iran. The United States, the Federal Republic of Germany, provided Iraq with the mechanism to develop chemical weapons to use against the Iranian people. So Saddam Hussein, a historical enemy of the Iranian people, and the Taliban knocked out by not the Iranians, but by the United States of America. So in 2003, Iran now, without adversaries on either borders, stretches its wings into the region. And the United States, the CIA in particular, saw that this was a huge disaster conducted by the US government. I was reporting this, the whole argument for this, by the way, is in my book, The Death of the Nation, The Future of the Arab Revolution. I'm showing this to you because it has all this evidence in it. It has all the stories, because I reported these wars. I traveled to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to Syria several times during the war. I reported this war, but I also met serving CIA people. And they would tell you directly that these were the two most idiotic wars that the United States has ever prosecuted. And let me tell you, the United States government has prosecuted some really idiotic wars. There's a long history of prosecuting idiotic wars, including the war prosecuted against the Vietnamese people. You know, when people say things like, well, Vietnam, it's not really a socialist country, try building socialism after your country has been bombed to smithereens by the United States, who used chemical weapons and destroyed agriculture in the central part of Vietnam. And then you have American left figures saying, well, they're not really socialists. But good luck to you. What kind of socialism you've been building in the United States? I'd like to see that. Judging the Vietnamese after you've destroyed their agriculture by bombing it with chemical weapons. It was called Agent Orange, but essentially that's a chemical weapon. So the Iranians stretch out on both sides of their border. You see some renewed activity, linkages renewed with Hezbollah and others. And it's at this point that the United States, egged on by Saudi Arabia, but the US government doesn't need much egging on. Egged on by Saudi Arabia, egged on by the Israelis, tried to put Iran back to its borders. And so what do you see? You see the 2003 Syria Accountability Act. The attempt to destabilize the government in Syria begins long before the events in Daraa in southern Syria. It begins long before the so-called Arab Spring. It begins with the 2003 Syria Accountability Act, where the United States tried to break the connection between Iran and Syria. That goes back to 2003, friends. That doesn't start in 2011, 2012. It's a great misreading of the history of the Middle East to believe that somehow the United States should have entered there to help human rights of the Syrian people in 2011-12. It's a great misreading of history. The intervention by the United States, by the Obama administration, nothing to do with human rights. It had everything to do with this attempt to break the cord between Syria and Iran. And you see that in the 2003 Syria Accountability Act. It then moves to the green-lighted invasion attack, terrible attack of Lebanon by Israel to attempt to smash Hezbollah in 2006. That was green-lighted, and Hezbollah came out of that stronger actually than it was before the war. It comes out as the victor of that war. And the third event that begins to in order to push Iran back to its borders is this whole nuclear facade. It was a facade, let's face it. There was no nuclear threat from Iran. The whole thing is a concocted mess by Western intelligence. There was no threat. At no point had Iran said that they're going to become a nuclear power. Look at the hypocrisy. I'd like to just put the hypocrisy before you. India is not a signatory to the International Atomic Energy Agency's, India is not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, not at all. India is not a signatory to the NPR, and yet India has twice exploded nuclear weapons, 1974 and then in 1998. Twice India tested nuclear weapons. Iran, on the other hand, is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, allows inspectors from the IAEA into Iran, and has never tested a nuclear bomb. And yet India and the United States in this period crafted a very close strategic alliance, and Iran is the problem. And people in the United States believe, therefore, that Iran is a problem. That's extraordinary. I mean, evidence be damned. You know, evidence be damned. This is akin to believing that you know, whatever, the UFOs are landing in somewhere, or that the devil is a real creature, or whatever those surveys show you about what people believe. It doesn't matter what the reality is. The fact is they've demonized Iran deeply and made Iran into the principal problem. And a lot of these wars, yes, of course, there's oil involved. Yes, of course, rare earth minerals and so on. But a lot of these wars is the United States essentially operating as the forward military force of Saudi Arabia and the Israelis in this area. I mean, let's put it bluntly. That's what's going on here. The United States operates as the forward military post of the Saudi government and of the Israelis. In 2009, the United States government put a terrorism label on Kataib Hezbollah, which is an Iraqi militia group which has close links to Iran. This is in 2009. It'll come back why this is important. By the way, somebody has their mic open, and I'm hearing some noise in the back, so it's a little distracting. If you don't mind just shutting.
I'll take a look.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's just a little distracting. It sounds like an airport. It's hard to give a talk in an airport. I have tried that before, but it's not easy, so sorry. Anyway, so my sense here is that the Kataib Hezbollah was put on the terrorism list in 2009. Again, this is before the Dara events. This is before any question of the United States, you know, coming in to help the Syrian people and so on. Okay, so this will become important in a second. The United States goes after the Syrian government. We know that there's a longer history of it, but we know it gets cloaked in human rights. We know that this is a serious problem because even in Libya, the United States, following the French and the British, US doesn't always lead, it often follows. As I mentioned to you, the policy in West Asia is frequently United States following the Saudis and the Israelis. On Libya, they followed Nicolas Sarkozy. He really led the file on Syria. It wasn't Hillary Clinton, but she was very gung-ho on this. But he led the file on this. You know, just a few days ago, the Norwegian foreign minister from that period gave an interview, very important interview, where he said that in March 2011, the Norwegian foreign ministry had cut a deal between the rebels in Libya and the Libyan government of Muammar Gaddafi. They had a plan for the transition. Mr. Gaddafi was going to leave, but the state institutions were going to remain. And the French, the British, and the US government scuttled that agreement and deliberately bombed the country without allowing a peace process to develop. By the way, the negotiators from the African Union were sitting on a plane in Addis Ababa, ready to fly to Tripoli. They were, I spoke to several of them. They said they were sitting on the runway, ready to fly. The French had been informed, NATO had been informed. Before their plane could take off, French bombers went and started the bombing run in Libya. So now you tell me, who is the defender of human rights here? whose game are they playing? One must always contest this idea that the United States is a champion of human rights or civil rights, or interested in the people of Syria or interested in the people of Iran. I mean, look at it this way. On the anniversary of when the US prosecuted an illegal war in Iraq, on that anniversary, the anniversary of a war that Mr. Biden supported, Mr. Biden had the temerity to give an interview where he calls Vladimir Putin a killer. I mean, you know, what kind of behavior is this? These people are certainly not credible humanitarians. This is the language of a gangster. You know, this is the language of a gangster. You remember Hillary Clinton's interview after Gaddafi was sodomized and then assassinated on the streets. She said, what did she say? She said, we came, we saw, and we conquered. This is the mindset of the US ruling class. It's not human rights that they want to prosecute. It's this. It is a form of putting power down against other people, oppressing people. This is what in an earlier period one called imperialism. When will we use that language again? And when will we be able to take that language to the people so that this is not seen as anachronism, but something that is happening right now? In fact, it's exactly the kind of policy that the United States is prosecuting against China at this moment. Biden, what did Biden do to Syria? There were some rockets fired in Erbil near the airport. And in February, what did the United States government decide to do? They said that the people, Kataib Hezbollah, who were placed by the US government on the terrorism list in 2009, 3 years before the events in Daraa, 2.5 years before the events in Daraa, they said that Kataib Hezbollah and 2-3 other groups had fired rockets at the airport in Erbil, where the United States has a presence. Why the US has a presence in Erbil, that should be raised in the UN Security Council. What is going on? Why are there still so many US troops in Iraq? Rockets are fired, and then the United States retaliates by bombing 2 villages on each side of the Syria-Iraq border. They bombed 2 villages on each side of the Syria-Iraq border in the name of self-defense. What self-defense? How have these villages at any point threatened the United States government? You place troops or you place contractors in Erbil airport and somebody fires rockets at them. There's no need for any kind of evaluation or no need for any public discussion. You just bomb anybody. This is a little bit like Obama's kill list. I'm giving you this as a kind of a testimony because I don't have faith in the US ruling class. You see, I don't believe that it's going to be that easy to pressure people in Congress or to pressure the Democrats and so on. I think there needs to be a deeper assessment about the weakness of the human movement, the humanitarian movement in the United States. I read Obama's autobiography. It's called Promised Land, a title itself that made me feel a little ill. I read this autobiography. There's a section where he justifies the kill list. A section where he justifies the kill list. I was very disturbed by that section. And I'm speaking to you because I still feel a little worked up because I remember reading that section. In the section on the kill list, Mr. Obama, who, you know, is a man who doesn't accept the death penalty. You remember this, that he has that history of being a law professor and, you know, was at University of Chicago and so on, and, you know, friendly with liberals and very kind and decent man and charismatic and so on. Mr. Obama, with a record against the death penalty, goes into the White House. He's informed by his national security team. He's informed by all of them that, you know, on, I think it's Thursday, you're going to have to come into the secure room. We're going to show you a list of people and you have to sign at the bottom and authorize the execution by drone strike or other means. It was the kill list. He writes about it openly in Promised Land. And then he said, you know, I had some qualms about this, but he said, my chief of staff said to me, and this is Obama writing, this is not me putting words in anybody. I don't know if the chief of staff actually said that, but this is what Obama says. He says, my chief of staff told me that a liberal democratic president must not give the appearance of weakness. In other words, the United States president, the liberal US president, you know, this great beloved, great hope of the liberals in the United States, the liberal president comes to his own autobiography, looking back at 8 years of his own tenure as the president, the most powerful man in the United States government, says that he authorized the killing of hundreds, if not more people, because he did not want to appear weak. It's a constitutional lawyer speaking. This is somebody who understands the UN Charter speaking. I did not want to appear weak, therefore I authorized the killing of hundreds of people around the world. Now you come and tell people in Waziristan what they feel about the US government. You come and tell them why they are so angry about what has happened to their lives and why that war in Afghanistan, which seems never to end, regardless of the administration, conservative, liberal, whatever, it's a war that the US ruling class seems to want to prosecute without care for its own morals. How are you going to talk to those people about peace and so on? I mean, I appreciate people going on journeys. Everybody on this call feels terrible about it. But that means that the general strategic orientation to building a peace movement in the US is just not working, because there's just too much faith in the fact that there's a liberal wing of the ruling class that somehow is going to extricate itself from this mess that US history has driven the world into. I don't think that's going to happen. It has to be another strategy. I'm happy. I mean, Phyllis is very good at pointing out all the various opportunities. I'm extremely happy that there is the growth of various platforms, the DSA and others that are taking moderately good positions on many issues. I'm very happy about that. But something else needs to be tried. It's not enough to hope that the Democrats will reform themselves. It's just not enough, because they are not reliable. They are the liberal wing of a wretched ruling class. They are the liberal wing of a wretched ruling class. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Vijay. I appreciate that very much. Several people have been asking in the chat. We will be doing follow-up that you can get the recording and also the action and resource pages. Colonel Wilkerson evidently was not able to join us today. We hope he's okay, but that does leave us a little bit more time for Q&A. And I want to start with something that that was touched on briefly, but I think maybe could use more exploration. And several people mentioned in the chat, the sort of unholy trinity between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States in terms of policy in the region. There were some people that even admitted under Trump that he had sort of subcontracted out US policy in the region to Saudi Arabia and Israel. I'd love to hear both of your analysis of how true that is. How true is this attempt to do more than contain Iran, but that's certainly one of the main emphases is containing Iran between this unholy trinity of the US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia.
You want to start first, Vijay?
No, please go ahead. Please, Phyllis.
I think that it certainly is true that this notion of an anti-Iran coalition that Trump kind of articulated, but was very much in place even before Trump, under Obama, under Bush, and before that, is an old part of US strategy in the region. It's designed to prevent the rise of a regional power. You know, historically, if you look at the Middle East, West Asia region, there were really only two countries that had the indigenous capacity to emerge as regional hegemons, meaning they had size of land and population, they had wealth, usually from oil, and they had water. The only ones that had both of those were Iran and Iraq, historically. And with the US destruction of Iraq, which of course didn't begin in 2003, but began in 1991 with the first US war against Iraq, followed by 12 years of absolutely crushing sanctions, Iran was left as essentially the only regional power that could emerge to challenge the global hegemonic role that the US was playing in the region, which had to do with military bases, had to do with the extension of military force, had to do with oil, had to do with other resources, had to do with a whole range of strategic interests. In that context, you had a scenario of the rise and fall of an earlier tension between Iran and Iraq as regional hegemonic powers. So suddenly that's gone. Turkey arises for a brief period of time. The Turkish economy improves, and there's some, despite the neoliberalism, there's some potential there. for Turkey emerging in a political way in that sense, but that doesn't go any further. So you now have this concentration by the Gulf states, by Israel, by the US on Iran as the one potential center of this kind of challenge at the regional level. And in that context, you see this rise of the hysteria, as Vijay was talking about, around a false nuclear claim. You see nothing about the Israeli nuclear arsenal, which is more destabilizing than any other part of the arming of all forces, all sides in the region. This is one of the most overarmed regions in the world. And the question of the military capacity of Israel is simply not spoken of. The US has accepted the Israeli desire for what they call strategic ambiguity, where they neither confirm nor deny what the whole world knows is an enormous nuclear arsenal that is now in the process of being modernized, like the nuclear arsenal here in the United States. And so it's one of those even if questions, even if at some point Iran decided they wanted to move towards a nuclear weapon, which, as Vijay said, all 16 US intelligence agencies agreed long ago that Iran never decided to build a nuclear weapon, never had a nuclear weapon, had a nascent nuclear weapons program for a couple of years that ended back in 2003 and has never been rebuilt and did not produce anything that even looked like a nuclear weapon, even if at some point they decided to reverse that and change it, which would not be so easy for a host of domestic reasons. It would not be an existential challenge to Israel, as we are so often told. It would be a challenge only to Israel's nuclear hegemony, Israel's nuclear monopoly in the region. That's what it would challenge. And, that's not something that is even talked about. So this notion of Iran as the central target for the Gulf states, for Israel, and this set of new processes of normalization with Israeli colonization and apartheid, known as the Abraham Accords, has made all of that easier. It's not anything new for Israel to have very good security relations, military relations, and indeed trade relations with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, with Qatar, with all of these countries, but it was never able to be public because there was massive public opposition to it in countries which don't particularly care about public opinion, but they do care about the potential of being overthrown. So they never wanted to talk about it. Somehow now, with the support of the Trump administration being so public and so visible, creating this set of new agreements, which the Biden administration has now welcomed, putting aside what they are really about in terms of normalization and looking solely at what this allows for the public emergence of an anti-Iran coalition. It's a very, very dangerous moment in the region. And from what we can tell, there's going to be a consistent level of support for it from the Biden people. There's a clear split in the Biden administration strategic thinking about the region. But right now, the side that seems to be winning is the side that is very much part of the traditional understanding of the need for US domination in the region to remain unchallenged.
Well, it's very interesting that you mentioned Israel's nuclear weapons. That program, if you believe Seymour Hersh's book, which I think is probably one of the best sources, the Samson option, was actually meant because Israel didn't necessarily trust the US nuclear weapons umbrella. They wanted an independent deterrent against the Soviet Union, believe it or not. And of course, got a lot of help from France. Vijay, did you want to weigh in on this question of this unholy trinity and its influence, or did you want to wait for another one?
I'll just make one small comment, which is that I'm very skeptical about the US entry back into the so-called Iran nuclear deal. Just as I'm skeptical about the US return to the Paris climate accord. The reason I'm skeptical is, you see, the United States has this split of strategic options. The Trump period was very interesting. Trump basically said the Europeans are useless, they're not good allies, we'll seek other allies. And he went and strengthened the Quad in Asia, Australia, Japan, and India. And in fact, when he was leaving office, he gave the highest military award, the Legion of Merit, to Shinzo Abe, to Scott Morrison, and Narendra Modi. this is not an alliance strategy that Biden has walked away from, because his first major meeting was with the Quad, the virtual meeting about 10 days ago. And then Blinken and Lloyd Austin went to Japan, just before that horrendous meeting in Anchorage, Alaska with the Chinese diplomats. We don't need to get into all that, but I'm saying all this because Biden's attempt has been to reassert US-European ties. And for the Europeans, basically the down payment to restart those ties is the entry of the American government back into Paris and into the Tehran deal. That's the down payment. I don't think there's seriousness actually in Washington, D.C. security circles to have an actual linkage with the Iranian government when it comes to the procedures set out in that 2015 treaty. This is all going to be in name only. Let's be clear that even during Obama, they didn't actually negotiate the Iranians to the table. There was no real trust on either side. And so I very much don't feel like this is not the instrument to create a long-standing grand bargain in the Middle East. The instrument for that is not this Iran deal. People should not put that much into it. I would say that the instrument for that has to be regional. I mean, in the book I wrote some time back, I was very much idealistically hoping for the grand bargain between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's a ridiculous idea. I recognize that, but that's the core of the problem. It goes back to 1979 because when the Iranian Revolution takes place, it produces an enormous ideological and political challenge to the Saudi government, because the Saudis for years had been saying that any Republican government in a majority Muslim country has to be an apostatic government. It's an apostasy to have republicanism. Despite the fact that the largest Muslim country in the world, or it's not a Muslim country, but the largest country with Muslims, that is Indonesia, then Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, they don't have Islamic states. Pakistan only had one from 1977, but 30 years it was not an Islamic state, it was a Republican administration. It didn't have a monarchy. Iran was a direct threat on the borders virtually of Saudi Arabia because you had an Islamic republic. And that was a big challenge. You could see there was a genuine upsurge inside Saudi Arabia saying there's no contradiction between republicanism and Islam. And that really put the fear into that royal family. I mean, we tend to look at things, maybe too economically sometimes. Sometimes there are political, familial kinds of things that make an impact on the thinking, particularly of family-led dictatorships. They have their own agenda, their own thinking. You talk to a Saudi, they will talk to you about how the Iranians are not really Muslims, how they have this, that, the other. It's a different order. It's that needs to be settled in a way. There's a grand bargain between Iran, because that wedge provides the opening for the United States. That wedge provides the opening. If there was not that wedge, if there was a regional concord, I think we'd have much less of a problem. And I agree with others who basically say that the greatest threat to that region is not so-called Islamic fundamentalism, it's arms dealers.
If I could just add one point on.
Sure, go ahead.
I mean, I agree with everything that Vijay just said. I would add, though, I guess I do disagree with one thing, which is that I think the getting back into the JCPOA is a prerequisite for anything that might ever lead to a serious region-wide grand bargain. The grand bargain is not going to be through the JCPOA, but because of the political moment, with the Iranian elections coming in June, probably by the middle of April or the end of April at the latest, they will be in full-fledged campaign mode. It's going to be impossible on the Iranian side to negotiate unless the sanctions have been at least partially lifted, if not fully lifted. There's no legal legitimacy for the US's position, absolutely none. And it's true that the US doesn't care about that. So the question of whether the European effort to create we will provide face saving for both of you, whether that can work. Having China and Russia in the deal is crucial for exactly that reason. It's not only the Europeans and the US. So I think it is very important, and I think we and in our movements should be very focused right now on pressure to get the JCPOA back on track. then we can look towards what could become at some future point the question of a grand bargain, as was under discussion in 2001 and 2002. We should not forget that Iran was a great collaborator with the United States on the war in Afghanistan, and creating an alternative government that was imposed in Bonn, created in Bonn. It was the US and Iran were the main operators in creating that US-backed government. So, a lot of that is still potentially possible, but I think if we lose the opportunity of getting back into the JCPOA, it's almost impossible to imagine how it could happen.
Well, and that's come up just in the last week, and some of the pushback to the cynical attempt to stop Biden from getting back into the JCPOA by saying you have to address all these other issues with Iran. I believe, to his credit, Rob Malley said we have to do JCPOA first, and then we can talk about this. And I'm somebody who is actually optimistic in the long term that the United States and Iran could be friendly, could have friendly relations. Also, it was rarely reported, but I believe Saudi Arabia did have a lower level diplomatic démarche or entreaty to Iran last year, because Saudi Arabia understands that they can't just win this war in Yemen, particularly if we do our jobs here in the United States to cut off US support. One thing I just wanted to throw out, and then I'm going to go to Sophia Wallman to ask her question live, because it's a little bit out of the box, but I think it's an important issue in terms of alternative power structures that could be built by other countries of the world. The recent interim national security strategy that the Biden administration put out just 2 weeks ago is worth a read. It's 23 or 24 pages. They'll do something longer. There's some good stuff in there about, human rights and humanitarianism and blah, blah. It's mostly meant to assure US elites that we're going back to a regular foreign policy after Trump. But the one thread that goes through most of it is hyping the threat inflation with China. And that'll probably be another webinar that we'll need to do. That's certainly going to have global and regional implications, and probably also in the Middle East as well. Sophia, if you could ask your question, it's a little bit out of the box, but I'd like to hear it from you rather than me trying to paraphrase it. And it does bring in another aspect of something that I think is important for us in the US to consider, and how we can be in solidarity with movements in other countries around the world.
Thanks. Happy spring, everyone. So, yeah, I'm curious, just like how the movement to abolish prisons or to abolish ICE, or water protectors who are saying like, this is sacred land and our mother, stop violating her, challenges so many of the just dominant kind of discourses of our time. I'm curious how you all see the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as a kind of similar response to a power over domination model of not only militarism, but just investing in death and destruction, and kind of using those to uphold oppressive economic systems and things like that, and the way that we in the US can or should be engaging with the ban treaty, which is, could be seen as out of the box, but is also, a response from so many countries that have not, like countries as entities that haven't had their experiences kind of represented, or so another example of kind of marginalized parties speaking back to those in power.
And civil society.
It was a good segue from the JCPOA.
And civil society as well. It wasn't just governments.
Exactly.
It was civil society and governments that said, and the thing is, all these governments are already prohibited from having nuclear weapons by the NPT. So it was the vote of no confidence against the US and the other nuclear powers, because they're not living up to Article 6 of the NPT, which they're supposed to be doing. So I guess you could, the non-proliferation or the disarmament aspect of it is one thing, but the other is countries coming together to say that they are not pleased at all with the status quo. They don't actually gain anything. They're already prohibited from getting nuclear weapons, and they still said it's important to sign this treaty. Do either of you want to comment on either of those aspects, or any others?
One thing just quickly is that I think it is important that we distinguish between non-proliferation and disarmament, because non-proliferation is the weapon of the powerful, essentially. That's Article 4 of the NPT, that says that all the non-nuclear weapon states that are recognized as non-nuclear weapon states have both obligations and rights, and their obligations are to not get, not build, not obtain, and not use, etc., any nuclear weapon. But they have rights, ostensibly, to two things. One has to do with nuclear power, which we could nicely do without, thank you very much, but that is in the treaty. But the other is they have the right to seeing the 5 nuclear weapons signatories of the NPT move towards full and complete nuclear disarmament, the Article 6 part. And that's the disarmament part that people, if you ask people in the State Department, even who negotiated the NPT back in the 70s, they will say, we never took that seriously. So we have to take that seriously. This goes directly to this point about the role of social movements and civil society, that the ban is not a legally enforceable ban because there is no legal enforcement of international law. International law, like law anywhere else, it only exists to the degree that there's somebody to enforce it. And that's the challenge that we have. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have weight, that it doesn't have significance. It's a tool in our hands, in the hands of movements, in the hands of governments that want to take it up. You know, when South Africa, on the verge of losing white control, decided to give up its nuclear capacity at that time, which it had built in collaboration with Israel, it was for all the wrong reasons, because it was afraid it never wanted to have Black people with their hand on the button. And when a Black-led Rainbow Nation came into office under Nelson Mandela in 1994, they decided not to try and rebuild it because they recognized it was still right, even if it had been done for the wrong reasons. So there's all kinds of ways to use it, and making it a tool in the same way that the UN Charter is not enforceable except to the degree that countries and people are prepared to embrace it and enforce it. But when we go to our governments, and more importantly, when we go to our people and say, the UN says this, it turns out that actually does matter. Because for all of the efforts, particularly if we look at the Reagan years in the 1980s, this huge set of campaigns against the legitimacy of the United Nations that was going on at that time, and the earlier ones, the John Birch Society, get the US out of the UN and get the UN out of the US, all of that nonsense. They tried to persuade us that people across the United States don't support the UN, that they believe in black helicopters, that the UN is taking over the country, and blah, blah, blah. Turns out none of that's true. It never played out that way. People do have enormous respect for the United Nations. So for us, it's a gift. It's a gift to have a tool that we can use when we write letters to the editor, when we mobilize in the streets, holding it up to say, we're here in enforcement. This is an enforcement operation to enforce this important treaty that the US refuses to sign. The same with the International Criminal Court, with so many others. You know, the International Convention on the Rights of the Child, for God's sakes. The US is now the only country. It used to be, there was 2. It used to be Somalia was in there too. Now there's only 1. The US is the only country in the world that has not supported the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's a tool for us to challenge our own government. So I think in that sense, it's a very, very important step forward.
Thanks, Phyllis. Vijay, did you want to comment on this or anything else you wanted to wrap up, because we're about at our time?
Well, thanks for that reminder about the treaty. Look, campaign on anything, campaign on everything. You got a campaign to build anti-war. Well, no, you got a campaign to build a humanitarian majority in the United States of America. So campaign on everything. I'm not going to say that it's a bad idea or a good idea, and the merits of it are rather, off the point, because there are 2 huge ideological battles to overcome in the United States. One is this idea that it's the greatest country in the world. Look, Obama's book is called Promised Land. What promised land? On a particular day last, I think, month, as many people died of COVID-19 as died on 9/11. You know, I mean, this is a shambolic situation. And yet there is this enduring belief it's the greatest country ever. Not even the greatest country in the world now, but the greatest country ever. Promised land. Seriously, you got to get this out of people's brains. There is no such thing as the greatest country in the world. There is no country greater than any other. Every country is on its journey. People are on their journey trying to make the world a better place. When will people get out of this habit? Because this habit allows people to believe that their country operates benevolently overseas, This is the second great barrier to building a genuine anti-war movement. There is this feeling that the United States operates overseas benevolently, which is why even left liberals rally behind the flag, saying, let's support our military when it does these things. We are saving human rights here, there, and everywhere. It's extraordinary that people have this deep faith that the government is benevolent. It's not the greatest country in the world, and the government is not necessarily benevolent. Sometimes it might be benevolent. Of course, that's possible, but quite often it's not. So this major ideological challenge is a great obstacle to building that anti-war majority. Just, I'll give you one fact, Kevin, just because you've probably read the new SIPRI report, or at least the executive summary of it. This is the new report from the Stockholm Institute of Peace and Research and so on. This report shows that in the last year, the United States increased its share of arms exports in terms of total arms exports from 32% to 37%. United States has been the biggest arms exporter in the world for a very long time. And in this period, Russia and China have decreased arms exports. This is fascinating. And yet, there is a belief that China is the great threat to the planet. Admiral Philip Davidson came before the US Armed Services Committee and said, public record, okay, not some secret hearing. He said in that the Indo-Pacific Command that he leads needs $5 billion this year, including to buy hypersonic cruise missiles and so on, which would strike Beijing in 15 minutes. And he said this and then look at the sentence he said. This is a direct, he said that the United States must be prepared to fight. It's not a deterrent. He said we must be prepared to fight. The most chilling words thus far of 2021. Admiral Philip Davidson in front of the US Senate, be prepared to fight. I mean, are people in the United States going to be prepared to back a government that prosecutes a war against China? Is that where we're going? I mean, this country needs the most robust peace movement. In order to build that, you have to transcend this obstacle of believing, you have to fight ideologically to say there is no such thing as the greatest country in the world. And the government does not always operate in the interests of everybody or benevolently. As long as these barriers exist, it's going to be very hard to build a majority, a powerful enough majority that can roll back the kind of hold that the militarism has on US society, culture, and the state.
Thank you, Vijay. I appreciate that very much. So folks, I know that I'm very energized, but I see that from the participants that people are starting to drop off, and we've been at it for about 2 hours. Again, I want to thank Massachusetts Peace Action, also Chicago area Peace Action Wisconsin, Peace Action of Maryland, my Peace Action chapter affiliate. And again, please check out the action and resource page that we put in the chat. Also, Brian has said that there will be a follow-up email with a recording. Please post this and proliferate this recording widely so that others, your friends, colleagues, neighbors, etc., can benefit from the incredible wisdom of our fantastic panelists. Please use the resources. We'll also have the links to the resource and actions pages that goes out to everybody. Please check out the next webinar on China, which we've already sort of inadvertently done a commercial for next Tuesday, same channel, next Tuesday evening. And one of the things that I think is important for us to try to imbue in ourselves, obviously this work is very hard and I've been doing it for a long time. I feel fortunate and blessed that I get to do it every day. But there is an attitude that I think is summed up in a line from a David Crosby song, which is, peace is not an awful lot to ask. And I think that should be our attitude, that peace should be the norm. It shouldn't be this impossible dream. Peace is not, in fact, an awful lot to ask. Thank you very much for spending your afternoon with us and for all you do to proliferate peace and social justice.
Thank you, everybody.